You may be familiar with the story of Laura Palmer, the homecoming queen whose murder kickstarted the iconic series Twin Peaks, but do you know about Hazel Drew? Like Laura, she was a young, dignified woman who met with foul play under mysterious circumstances, her body washing ashore a lake in upstate New York. Both Laura Palmer and Hazel Drew were murdered, but Hazel's actually happened. Her grisly unsolved demise from over a century ago has since served as a cautionary tale for going into the woods, especially when there's black as midnight on a moonless night. Hazel and the story of her death would have been forgotten too, were it not for a local woman recounting the tale to her visiting grandson. That grandson, it turns out, was Mark Frost, a writer who would use the story of Hazel Drew as major inspiration for the twisting tale of Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks. Just as reality can inspire fiction, stories we're told through TV shows and movies can impact what happens in our world. In the time since Twin Peaks, Hazel's murder has become the subject of re-examination, with experts trying to piece together a mystery from over 100 years ago. We can't begin to understand any of this without going back to the source of it all, Hazel Drew. Oh, and we'll need donuts. And coffee. Hazel was found on July 11th, 1908, floating face down in Teals Pond, Sand Lake, New York, right outside of Troy. Cause of death, a blow to the back of the head, her skull crushed with a blunt, unknown weapon. Hazel came from a working-class family and led a seemingly ordinary life. She worked as a domestic servant, making a modest living doing basic housekeeping chores in a seemingly ordinary small town. She went to work, went to church, and spent time with her friends. By all accounts, she was considered stunningly beautiful, vibrant, and outgoing. Her beauty was marked, and even among the host of pretty girls of Troy, Hazel Drew was distinctive. All seemed normal in the 20-year-old woman's life, but Hazel's quiet, normal little life was not at all what it seemed.
By far the most interesting analogy between Laura and Hazel is that they were living two lives, and somehow they managed to dichotomize them in a way that people weren't aware. If you said, tell me about Hazel Drew, what they would say was, she never missed a curfew. She was church-going every Sunday. She was demure. She was polite. She was courteous. She was virginal. And then there's another side that said, she was very flirtatious and had several relationships, that she traveled extensively. This was a totally messed up woman that somehow managed to put forth an image that she was not, that she was somebody completely other than who she was.
In the 19 days following the discovery of her body, it was uncovered that Hazel was living well beyond her modest means. The police, led by Detective Duncan Kay, quickly found discrepancies in her ordinary life. She took frequent trips to Boston, New York City, Rhode Island, and often bought tailored clothing, an extravagant purchase for a mere domestic servant. Hidden within her trunk were dozens of postcards and letters, a prominent amount of which were from a secret admirer only known as C.E.S. Yet to her friends and family, she had no romantic relationships. And that wasn't the only thing that didn't add up. In the days leading up to her death, Hazel began behaving erratically. She would go to the town's dressmaker in the middle of the night demanding that she would make her clothes. She abruptly quit her job for no reason, and then she left to go visit friends in nearby Water Villette. Sadly, she would never make it. Stranger still is that no one there was actually expecting her. The next time anybody saw her, she was dead. As details surrounding her private life unraveled, the list of suspects began to grow, including her one-time neighbor Frank Smith, a dentist who proposed to her, a train conductor, her own uncle William Taylor, and many others. But there was never enough evidence to prosecute anyone, and eventually the police gave up. The case went cold. Hazel's legend would live on through local lore, told by residents such as Betty Calhoun, who would retell the tale to her visiting grandson, Mark.
I stumbled across this quote from Mark Frost. Someone asked him, about the start of Twin Peaks, but specifically the start of the story was, Laura Palmer. Her body is found washed ashore. What he actually said was he had known a story from his childhood about this ghost that haunted the lakes up in this upstate New York, Sand Lake, New York, that his grandmother would tell him about.
It's not like everybody in Taborton knew that story. Most people, in fact, didn't. So it was just something that Betty Calhoun pulled out of her bag of tricks, I think, to impress her young grandsons.
It was more of a ghost story, a folksy kind of tale. That dead girl will get you. Don't be out messing around late at night, that kind of thing.
So for Mark Frost, it may have started as a sort of visceral or subtextual or subconscious thing, but eventually he gleaned onto it, because I do know that he went back to the Sand Lake area to do some research into it, but it may just have been a very sort of subconscious thing that floated to his top of his memory at the time. So there's something about being scared as a kid that stays with you for the rest of your life. And I think that had to be part of the appeal for Mark Frost.
The story would leave a lasting impression on Mark, as grisly, mysterious murders tend to do on young children. Decades later, Mark would become a television screenwriter and would recall the story to his friend and director, David Lynch. Sometime in the late 80s, Mark Frost and David Lynch sat in a coffee shop mulling over ideas for a new television show, when suddenly they conjured up the image of a lifeless, beautiful blonde washed ashore on a small town lake. It was the notion of this girl's body being found on the edge of the water, the mystery remaining unsolved, the multiple aspects, and kind of cross-cultural and different social classes of people she interacted with. It really struck my fancy. And instead of Laura's murder taking place in Sand Lake, New York, the show was instead set in the near doppelganger equivalent of Snoqualmie, North Bend, later fictionally known as Twin Peaks. With Frost's inspiration in place, Laura was then shaped. Where Hazel was 20 years old, Laura was 17. She was a straight-A student, faithful girlfriend to the high school quarterback, and of course, the homecoming queen. She even delivered food to the elderly. She was nothing less than extremely admired, which is comparable to Hazel Drew, who worked an unsuspecting job as a housekeeper. She had no known romantic relationships, and too was loved and respected. Similarly to Hazel, Laura's death unveiled many, many secrets. Hazel had a trunk with anonymous letters and postcards, and Laura had not one, but 2 diaries, one of which portrayed the picture-perfect girl the people of Twin Peaks thought they knew, and then a secret one with much darker truths. And as it would turn out, Laura wasn't so faithful after all. She was actually in a secret relationship with Twin Peaks bad boy James Hurley, a prime suspect early in her investigation, akin to Frank Smith, a teenager who openly admitted he was attracted to Hazel and was also seen as a suspect early on. Oh, and it gets deeper. As discovered in the diary of Laura Palmer, she was a cocaine addict and a prostitute, which means she had countless lovers all through Twin Peaks. Now, we don't have proof to suggest the same for Hazel, but she did have a questionable, tangled history with several men, including a dentist, a train conductor, and a supposed millionaire. There's a lot. Twin Peaks was a phenomenon when it launched in 1990, leaving audiences begging the question, who killed Laura Palmer? But despite its initial success, the show's ratings declined as fast as they rose, partly due to pressure from ABC on Mark Frost and David Lynch to reveal the mystery of who committed the murder, and in doing so, paved the way to its cancellation after the 2nd season. Still, even after it ended, the show maintained a cult following that only seemed to grow more and more over time. Eventually, as Laura stated in its final episode of the 2nd season,
I'll see you again in 25 years.
It returned in 2017 with a 3rd season simply known as The Return. The show's unanswered questions and unsolved mysteries left fans obsessed with their own theories and ideas, often pulling at the remnants of what was left behind in the Twin Peaks universe. And with David Lynch being notoriously brief and cryptic about his work,
believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
We'll elaborate on that.
No, I won't.
there wasn't much to go off of. Eventually, the connection to Hazel Drew was found, giving fans not only another piece of lore in the Twin Peaks puzzle, but also a new mystery to unveil and unravel. This inspired experts and fans alike to investigate Hazel's murder on their own, leading way to documentaries, novels, community groups, and more.
Without this murder, we probably would not be talking about Hazel Drew today. And without Twin Peaks, we probably wouldn't remember the facts of this. And that's part of the story. You know, this is a murder that did go unsolved. She lived in Troy, New York, which at the time was one of the wealthiest cities in the world, coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And it's just a fascinating setting. She met her demise back out in the country where she had been born. And that's the first question. Why was she even out there? That's never really answered.
You know, part of exploring the whole Hazel Drew issue is really answering not just the question of who killed Hazel Drew, but who is Hazel Drew, or who was Hazel Drew.
Will Hazel's murder be solved? We'll see. After all, David Bushman and Mark Givens are working on a book, Blonde, Beautiful, and Dead, in hopes to crack that very mystery. Regardless, now she gets to have a legacy beyond the whispers of caution in a small town. Instead, Hazel Drew is now known for having inspired one of pop culture's most iconic television shows. Thank you so much for watching the first episode of True Fiction. As for this episode, I had discovered a ton of weird, interesting stuff about the Hazel Drew case. If you want to find out more, make sure to follow the link in the description below. As for next week's episode, it's all about the real truths behind Godzilla's origins. So, see you here next Sunday.